Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming tonight. I want to begin by thanking Christine Lowe and Joanne Oy and their colleagues in Civic Exchange and Clear Air Network for proposing and organising this event, and particularly for creating such fruitful partnerships in public health. I would also like to thank profoundly all those who worked with me in any capacity over the last 22 years, because I really have learned so much from you. My aim tonight is to try and, I would say, entertain rather than instruct, and I shall certainly try not to be too pedantic. But in doing so, I want to raise a few questions about the future of public health. Elucidating the answers to these may be work in progress over several years. Of course, public health is largely unfinished business at any point in time, but we need to constantly anticipate. And so, the first question, what should be the next public health priorities in Hong Kong? Second, I've tried to take a few steps back and learn about the state of our planet's health from the perspective of near space. I want to emphasize what we must learn from 150 years of public health here and elsewhere. I'm going to ask whether the new exposure sciences and what we know about gene-environment interactions are relevant to urban planning. And finally, ask whether we can, together, develop new approaches to risk communication and partnerships in public health. Well, the cover in Scientific American, a recent issue, emphasizes that our future lies in our hands and the need to manage carefully the way in which we interact with our environment. Earth's resources available for repairing and sustaining our living environment, which determines our health, are finite and therefore scarce. The legendary James Lovelock conceptualized Earth as Gaia, a dynamic ecological entity in which every facet of its surface and interior are interrelated and interdependent. Ours is the, so far, only known body in the universe which supports sentient beings, and therefore relevant to the concept which we call public health. Of course, Gaia doesn't stop, but as we know, public health often does. Hippocrates offered us the first framework for public health based on his assessment of the effects of airs, waters, and places on our well-being. And we now, 2,500 years later, at least pay lip service to clean water, clean air, and clean food as human rights, albeit we have serious difficulty in complying with this ethic. The determinants of population health, as you know, are predominantly our environment, our behavior and interaction with it, and of course our inborn and acquired individual susceptibilities. The applied disciplinary approach to health protection is the public health function. But let me emphasize at this point, this isn't simply and only a medical specialty. It should be multi-sectoral. And beyond all the environmental and medical jargon and technology, its ultimate goal must be fairness and equity, measurable as quality of life and happiness. Well, since Hippocrates' time, our transformation of our airs, waters, and places has impacted on the aesthetics and the sustainability of our habitat in ways which continually takes us by surprise and often conflicts with natural processes in ways which affect public health. For example, in Malaysia, deforestation to construct KL Airport displaced animal vectors and caused outbreaks of viral disease. Nearer to home, how many of you sat on this beach in the early 1990s, listened to birdsong, maybe saw rare tree frogs, and observed seemingly idyllic village life. Well, today all that's replaced by the sounds of globalization. Whatever the need for and benefits of that might be, these sounds, as you know, were completely silenced 2 weeks ago by a very modest movement of tectonic plates on the mid-Atlantic ridge. In Iceland, 7,000 miles away. But because of our global interconnectedness, economic interconnectedness, this plunged farmers on the African continent into financial crisis, with predictable effects on their family income and maternal and child health. 41 years ago, we took the first steps towards leaving this planet. It was a remarkable feat of rocketry achieved with onboard computing power, which is a tiny fraction of that in a modern cell phone. But how far has this technological prowess today been reflected in improving and harmonizing global public health? Well, listen. Yes. The sound of the four horsemen of the apocalypse: war, famine, pestilence, and death. Is this too melodramatic and overstated? I don't think so. Quite apart from the level of disease burden, global public health today, 40 years on, is characterized by enormous variation, uncertainty, and inequity. For example, large-scale neglect of maternal and child health. Even in developed countries, they are losing ground. Maternal mortality rates in the United States have doubled over the last 20 years, and children in many Western countries are increasingly predicted to die before their parents. The epidemiological transition to chronic disease in countries which were previously free of it continues relentlessly, but at the same time, we're having to learn over and over again to handle new forms of emergent infectious disease. We're continually creating hazards, health hazards that is, driven by poverty and income inequality. And lastly, but mostly, our unsustainable use of natural resources is an emergent global health risk factor on a very grand scale. However, most of this is not front-page news, from a public health viewpoint at least. In the 1970s, the Pioneer and Voyager spacecraft were dispatched to announce our presence to 200 billion star systems in our galaxy. But whichever extraterrestrial agents eventually decode the cargo, they will be surprised to find that there are apparently no daily threats to our existence here, no mention of disease epidemics or the commonest causes of death, or our almost total inability to get on with each other, let alone poverty, corruption, and armed conflict. While we've not developed the syntax which is necessary to communicate effectively with each other on public health issues, in an effort to contact other life forms, we are today firing messages into intergalactic space without much hope of evaluating their impact. My point is that this is an unfortunate similitude for much of what constitutes public health today. And it leads me to my main focus, which is the role of risk communication. Risk communication is the agent for change in public health. It's manifestly clear that scientists, the general public, policymakers and legislators do not necessarily, and perhaps infrequently, share the same perspectives and understanding on this issue. And that is a huge obstacle to progress in public health. Risk estimation relies on rigorous scientific measurement, and we must get that right. Risk evaluation is then dependent on scientific, social, political, and economic judgments, a shared responsibility. Finally, risk communication needs to take this evidence and match our target organ's information needs, avoiding ambiguity and contradictions in what should be a two-way process. Risk communication and the interventions which follow it must reliably protect health by interrupting pathways, for example, between the agent and the vector, between the vector and the susceptible host, and, if necessary and available, protect the host from the agent directly, for example, by using vaccines. Now, in that process, it's clear today that we're up against some formidable obstacles that we need to address. First, the phenomenon of beliefs. I mean, false beliefs which are unchallengeable by scientific reasoning, because they often, and perhaps unbelievably, are increasingly positioned as the antithesis of science. For science to guide our governance in public health, there must be people, at least a sufficient number, who believe in it, who accept the reasoning and believe in it. Acceptance of science has potentially many thresholds, dependent on understanding, but also prejudice. One dramatic contemporary example, at a time when we celebrate 150 years of Darwin and his theory of evolution, is that no fewer than 3 candidates for the US presidency were creationists. Creationism, and I use that as an example, or beliefs like it, are no basis on which to create, shall we say, intelligent design for public health. False beliefs may form an unassailable platform which precludes any possible success of risk communication. We've seen many examples of that in Hong Kong and across the world. They appear perhaps in the form of denialism. They are the scourge of the evidence-based approach, and we need mechanisms which will prevent denial corrupting scientific debate and disabling public confidence in science. But, and I emphasize this, we need to be able to distinguish denial from intellectually honest arguments which form the basis of skepticism. This is a massively increasing task because, as this bar chart shows, the knowledge base is mushrooming, now rapidly approaching 1 million new reports a year in the medical and health field alone. For the public health function to operate in a multi-sectoral approach, we must develop strategies which help ourselves and the public we want to address to navigate the evidence and then use it effectively. For example, to address uncertainty. And for that, we may need to invoke the precautionary principle to underpin the safety of our decisions. And last but not least, accountability, that important feedback loop which demands that we assess the outcome and the overall value of our actions. Now, my last piece of pedantry, I hope, is to draw your attention to an approach to this, a way in which we can represent all of our actions in this simple formalism, a 2x2 table, which allows us to assess the harms and benefits of all public health interventions. On the left-hand side, we've got the test, and the results of the test appear in these rows. Now, the test is not only a synonym for a blood test or an X-ray, but also our risk communication messages, the Bills Committee, and the subsequent ordinance on the statute book, for example, to prevent population harm from drink driving or road crashes, passive smoking, air pollution, or influenza. Our aim with our interventions, our tests, is to identify and protect, with the test results, those most at risk. They're in the left-hand column here. and ideally exclude from unnecessary intervention or action those not at risk in the right-hand column. Of course, in this process, there is often a trade-off to be made, but we strive to minimize the decision errors, shown here as false negatives in those at risk and false positives in those not at risk. So let's look at how we perform in this process. Well, Henry Ford did not value history, but in public health, we ignore it at the peril of those most vulnerable. In 1842, Edwin Chadwick, the legendary public health advocate and social reformer, wrote his essays on the need for a new approach to urban environmental health protection. They formed the basis for the English Public Health Act of 1848. Chadwick was very perceptive. He sold the idea of sanitation and hygiene not as welfare, but as a cost-effective management strategy. He said it would save money. Today in the US, they say $1 invested in cleaning up pollution generates a $4 return. But Chadwick found that this wasn't enough for the vested interests, who asked who was going to pay the capital costs for all this sewering and watering. And they obstructed legislative means to those sanitary ends. The false negative result was that although the bill was a milestone in public health, it was inconsistently implemented across different municipalities, and that cost lives. In Hong Kong, 34 years later, after years of conflict between successive colonial surgeons, that is, the latter-day directors of health, governors and their staff, the government then engaged Chadwick's son, Osbert, as a consultant to assess Hong Kong's dire problems of domestic and street hygiene. One overriding problem was that people lived among the feces of their indwelling domestic animals, such as pigs and cattle. Previous colonial surgeons' recommendations had been regarded as unaffordable and sent back for revision, that is, reinterpretation. But Chadwick produced a compelling, definitive analysis of our environmental hazards together with engineering solutions, and it still stands today as a model for environmental protection. It was challenged in LegCo on grounds of economics, not public health, as if the two were different. The cost of Chadwick's plan, but not the benefits, became the target of the vested interest led by a medical practitioner, Kai Ho Kai, none other than a fellow alumnus from Aberdeen University Medical School. Ho Kai's infamous declaration was, by this ordinance, millions of dollars will be sacrificed, vested interest interfered with, and public confidence shaken to its foundation. How often have we heard something similar to that in the decades which have followed? Ho Kai later softened his stance, but his bill was seriously weakened, and a few years later, Taiping Shan became the Hong Kong epicenter of the South China Plague, killing 80,000 people between here and Canton and exporting 2 million cases worldwide. The weary and dispirited Director of Health, Dr. Philip Ayres, said, "What all my reports could not do, the epidemic has done." The same legend could apply to the 1952 London smog, which preceded the Clean Air Act, but killed 4,500 people in the space of 5 days in the meantime. It could equally apply to the South China epidemic of heart and lung disease caused by air pollution today. More on that later. The threat to public health from uninformed beliefs or prejudice should not be underestimated. Recent examples include a president of South Africa declaring officially that AIDS is not caused by HIV, with all the expected adverse effects of that on social attitudes. The mullahs of Nigeria declaring that polio vaccine was a Western conspiracy carrying HIV virus, and the result of that was to create a pan-African polio epidemic, which even spread to the Middle East and Indonesia. Vatican officials who declared that condoms are unreliable, so they should not be used, and perhaps bankers, executives, maybe some government officials in Hong Kong declaring that air pollution is no worse than anywhere else as a justification for procrastination. Now, some of the most high-profile false negatives have resulted from actions by medical professionals. As scientists and advocates, we need to be keenly aware that many similar false negatives have resulted from a lack of professionalism. In the 1980s, my predecessor in the Glasgow University Chair of Public Health announced on a major TV channel and elsewhere that whooping cough vaccine was, quote, a dangerous witch's brew. The consequence was a dramatic fall in vaccine uptake and a sharp increase in the incidence of whooping cough, inevitably damaging for life many of the victims, while serious adverse reactions to the vaccine remained around 0.004%. Stewart had failed to assess the benefits and costs in the 2x2 table when the risk of the disease under vaccine protection approximated to zero. A similar recent solecism, I'm sure you're familiar with, was published in no less an authority than the medical journal The Lancet. It questioned the safety of MMR, the mumps, measles, and rubella vaccine. And again, the resulting lack of confidence led to outbreaks of disease. The author lost his job and his license to practice because of malpractice. And this episode, it's important to note, although it was characterized by bad science, it fueled heated debates between health authorities and those seeking to deny the benefits of vaccines. Again, major lessons were learned in retrospect. The message for everyone involved in health risk communication is very clear. Academics, other professionals, NGOs must engage the public using rigorous science, consistent with the rules for causality, and heed the need to explain uncertainty while supporting the precautionary principle, and avoid at all costs misleading or misinterpreted statements. It is often very difficult to recover from those defaults. Let me digress for 2 slides and just ask the question, why communicate science? Because it's relevant to some of the problems we need to address here. Well, first, in publicly funded institutions like universities, we need to serve between town and gown. We need to underpin the justification for our research funding applications. Increasingly, the universities, our employers, demand higher profiles for the outputs. That's good in a sense, but it may also be a hazard. Of course, there's the what. These include setting standards in scientific communication, using independent peer-reviewed channels. Of course, using the media legitimately for coverage and effective communication of new findings and the avoidance of misinterpretation. The unwanted consequences, however, are there as important caveats. Increasingly, I regret, they include commercialism. Commercialism and headlines in the scientific journals sells copy in the same way that it does in tabloid newspapers. Sensationalism through complicity between scientists and journalists has been observed more frequently in recent years. Hubris is the enemy of veracity. Publications, if not properly crafted, may raise false hopes and also unwarranted fears. They may fail to make limitations transparent, and overall there may be important losses of messages in translation. For my next example, we need to take a quick side trip to the orbit of Saturn, in fact to its largest moon, Titan. Titan is the most Earth-like body in the solar system, but its atmosphere would be intensely poisonous for humans, comprising as it does compounds like carbon monoxide, benzene, acetylene, acetonitrile, and hydrogen cyanide, amongst other toxins. However, you don't have to visit Titan to sample this chemical cocktail. Wait for it. It is readily available on the streets of Hong Kong and in many buildings, including those catering establishments which violate the tobacco smoke-free legislation. The original public health approach to this problem, extending over nearly 40 years, was to take the evidence base for the harm of secondhand smoke in causing heart disease, cancers, and deaths from other causes, and incorporate them into legislation for health protection. Now, let's be clear. Millions of people in Hong Kong have benefited from this intervention. We know that from objective chemical tests of their body fluids. But many thousands did not benefit on the 1st of January 2007, and many still don't. What I suppose we might call realpolitik led to weakening of essential legislation, this time in the form of so-called grace periods and exemptions. It was the cause of major false negative outcome and health inequalities. We can measure the legacy of this in the accountability process. In this analysis by my colleague, Dr. Hakan Lai, you can see on the horizontal axis here the concentrations of PM2.5 particulates in catering establishments. This lozenge here represents the appallingly high level in smoke-free establishments, which is determined, of course, by our outdoor pollution. Here is the mean level, emphasize, the mean level in those establishments which were exempt from the legislation. On the vertical axis, we've got a measure of lung function, small airways function in the lungs of the catering workers. And you can see that there is a very clear curvilinear relationship. As the level of particles increased, lung function in these workers declined. This is a predictor of both current and future cardiorespiratory health problems in the workforce and their future mortality. A leader in this month's Hong Kong Medical Journal is titled Zero Tolerance for Asthma Deaths. Good. Can we now move to develop all public health risk communication so that the principle of zero tolerance applies to all involuntary exposures of any kind to people in their workplace, outdoors, and let's say especially to children? As an example of the need for a better balance in risk communication, this year has seen a surge in questioning about the management of the global H1N1 epidemic. This virus variant emerged probably from the fecal middens of concentrated animal feeding operations, this time amongst pig farms in Mexico. The virus has an important family history. It's a direct descendant of an avian virus which killed between 50 and 100 million people in 1918. Along with the virus, we've had the emergence of an army of, I would say, unqualified or uninformed experts, including parliamentarians in Europe and legislators in Hong Kong, offering gratuitous criticism of the provisions made for population coverage with vaccine supplies. In Hong Kong, this vaccine cost so far, I understand, about $230 million, or 0.04% of GDP. Now, the vaccine uptake was disappointing, but in the meantime, the risk of a highly pathogenic disease remains. There are two views we can take of flu. On the left-hand side here, from emerging evidence in the United States, we can see that in 2009, the absolute number of deaths was slightly less than the average experienced between 1979 and 2001 in severe, that is regular, seasonal flu outbreaks. But on the right here, you can see that the number of life years lost was very much higher. While the juries are still out, this clearly is not a false positive. It is killing younger people. Now, all health authorities are pondering how uncertainty and the precautionary principle can be better crafted in risk communication to the public and hopefully to their elected representatives. All this emphasizes that we're on a constant learning curve, and it tells us that the public health function needs to send clearer signals, help the receivers to assimilate and understand both causality and uncertainty, and to reinforce the primacy of health protection. Well, extraterrestrials with the right technology could make many inferences about the state of our environmental health, perhaps from light years away through spectroscopic analysis of our effluent, including the giant Asian brown cloud. Nearer in to Earth orbit, ET has been observing our inexorable transformation into what we could call an astronomical bulb. They will know that these nighttime illuminations are indicators of massive power generation and, in fact, reflect rivers of kinetic energy leading to intense releases of carbon dioxide, other pollutants, and even causing trauma and death from collisions. As an aside, if the United States had reduced its emissions by about 7% in 1990, as per the Kyoto Protocol, it is estimated it would have resulted in 80,000 fewer deaths by now. ET will realize that for children in these urban centers, the spectacle of the Milky Way is muted if they can see it at all. And ET would know that we are experiencing increasing problems with overheating in our cauldron-like cities, in Delhi, in New York, in Paris, where 15,000 people died in the high summer temperatures in 2003. They will know that our cities are increasingly unwalkable, unbreathable, and intensely noisy. Well, in light bulb Hong Kong and the emerging megalopolis of South China, I suggest there are many, many reasons why, in a new public health approach, we should take a fresh look at the impact of urban development on population health in the 21st century. And to illustrate my point, I want to turn first to one obvious important indicator of these adverse urban agents, and that is light pollution. The scientific literature, interestingly, is increasingly examining the impact of nocturnal light, other aspects of urban living, and the interactions between them on fundamental body functions. That is, our physiology, which has evolved over millions of years. Of course, photons drive our visual perceptions and reflexes, and also our central clock for daily rhythms, but also many other body clocks, coordinating the release of hormones and other signals which orchestrate the function of organs such as the heart, the brain, and the liver. Perhaps I needn't elaborate further. Everyone here has experienced the profound metabolic effects of jet lag. Current investigations focus on blue light exposure effects on sleep deprivation disorders, which in turn affect appetite and fat metabolism and the hormones which regulate them. The blue light leptin lipid pathway is now considered to be a very important additional causal agent in driving the obesity epidemic, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. The BMJ cover here declares obesity is an epidemic without treatment. That's correct. And we must take an urgent, anticipatory, preventive approach, at the very least for the sake of children and adolescents. But already we're coming from a long way behind. The impact of marked changes in many aspects of urban lifestyle over relatively short periods should not be underestimated. Shift work increases the risks of heart attacks, and the International Agency for Research on Cancer now affirms that night shift work increases women's risk of breast cancer. The Danish government acknowledges that and pays compensation for such a bad outcome in those shown to have been exposed. Please don't misunderstand me. No one is identifying disturbance in diurnal rhythms as the single most important factor in the development of these health problems. But avoidable hazards of urban living are contributing to the multifactorial causation of disease. In Hong Kong and Greater China, those channels of kinetic energy seen from Earth orbit have not only dimmed the night sky, but also our horizons, with loss of all the visual aesthetic rewards of shapes and colors, of seascapes and landscapes, as captured here by Ed Stokes. Our ET visitors will already have measured this trend and long realized we were facing large-scale epidemics of pollution-induced disease. We're seldom provided with clear environmental indications of direct harm to health, but we were this time. And as a jurisdiction, we have ignored it, misinterpreted it, or otherwise procrastinated. If we want a starting point for a political analysis of competency in risk communication and environmental protection, then here it is. The regional epidemic curve for avoidable cardiopulmonary disease, and it stretches over nearly 40 years. There are many bad outcomes of this. A child growing up in Hong Kong now effectively lives in a shrinking environment, with the distance to the visible horizon equivalent to being on a planet with a radius of less than 800 kilometers rather than the 6,300 kilometers on Earth. The public health issues are profound because low visibility caused by pollution is associated with a storm of inflammation throughout all body tissues, and it's lethal. We have recently shown in this analysis by Tuan Tak and colleagues that low visibility caused by pollution is directly related to daily illness and mortality. Here on the horizontal axis, we have visibility in kilometers. Here's where, depending on our level above sea level, we might be able to see in terms of the horizon, 25 to 30 kilometers. Here is the average visibility today in Hong Kong across the year. I emphasize average, about 12 kilometers. On the vertical axis, we have increasing risk of mortality. As visibility declines, there is a linear progression in daily deaths. And we've also demonstrated that every gram of pollutant kills more citizens in lower socioeconomic groups than those more privileged. It is a major cause of environmental injustice. Civic Exchange and its university colleagues have led the assessment of polluted air impacts on the Delta population. But today, instead of cleaner transportation, and particularly railways, we are embarking on a massive road building program, draining from the West PRD into our tiny enclave. The point I want to make is that these concrete roadways are direct risks for childhood respiratory disease, attacks of asthma, bronchitis, and pneumonia, adult hospitalization, and premature deaths in our already intensely polluted environment. As a layman, I have to hope that the ongoing judicial review of the permit for this project will in effect be a test of the public health evidence for risk and its avoidance, but maybe that's naive. Well, for my last priority this evening, I turn to the South China Morning Post of April the 5th, which announced yet another re-engineering of what I would regard as a treasured remnant of our old city, Ladder Street, with the implantation of an escalator. In 2004, Professor T.H. Lam, my colleague, and our team showed large-scale benefits of even very modest levels of physical activity in reducing mortality in Hong Kong. In recent years, the Department of Health inaugurated its Take the Stairs campaign, and for very good reasons. We evolved as a species on the move. We sat to eat, but otherwise needed constant legwork to put food on the table. Today, we've regressed from hunter-gatherer to couch potato, and our previous lifestyle is now mainly to be seen in museum displays. To earn our rice bowl today, we're mostly supported by our buttocks rather than legs. But because of our evolutionary history, physical activity causes an injury to our finely tuned muscle system, and indeed to whole body metabolism. The reason is complex but fascinating, and I suggest important for urban infrastructure development and our future lifestyle. Exercise immediately stimulates the release of a family of signals from muscle genes on different timescales, as you can see, to control glucose and fat metabolism. Some of these mechanisms respond to a single episode of exercise. But be warned, with inactivity, it also quickly regresses to the levels that we observe in type 2 diabetes. We need walkable or cyclable cities to protect transgenerational health. In the US and other countries, nutrition, inactivity, and obesity now rivals tobacco as the major killers. A new report from Europe this month in Archives of Pediatrics shows how moderate exercise in teenagers effectively counteracts the effects of obesity genes and regulates body mass index, waist circumference, and body fat percentage. So I suggest we should probably be circumspect about new motorized attachments for our butts, such as this Honda Easy Rider concept. Easy riders mean lazy genes. The possible approach to prevention and solutions to the obstacles I've described is not and cannot be part of anyone's exclusive intellectual property. I want to emphasize that message. I suggest our approach must now somehow involve a new energetic partnership between the research base in academia, the skills and resources of other NGOs, and then, hopefully, the proper understanding and support of the wider public. Our tasks include ensuring the integrity of published research, developing advocacy while at the same time defending, protecting our credibility. We need to develop new ways to put across what I would call probabilistic messages versus simple, definitive, apparently predictive messages, and handle the issue of uncertainty that I've referred to. We need to develop reliable and efficient pathways to effective communication. And so I ask the question, is it possible to create a new beginning in public health advocacy in Hong Kong, ensuring a strong evidence base, but greatly widening the conduits for its translation and transmission? To borrow Bill Barron's book title, The Great Disconnect, which he dedicated to the next generation, we need to deal with the Great Disconnect. We need to take account of the gap between what science says and the public hears. Deal with those false beliefs, with deliberate distortion, scientific illiteracy, and the obstacles presented by bureaucracy. What time is it? Well, a few years ago, I proposed the formation of a new standing body. I called it the Independent Commission for Public Health Protection, a kind of ICAC for health. It would be independent of government. It would be properly funded and resourced. Let's not pretend that we can layer this on top of already stretched public health resources. That's not going to happen. This body would define priorities which are directly and specifically relevant to modern urban settings. It would focus on synthesis and evaluation rather than discovery. It would continuously filter and translate evidence into risk communication and policymaking tools. It would rigorously externalize trade-offs, especially where they impact on child health. It would bring multidisciplinary skills to bear on complex issues in the best tradition of civic exchange. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, it would support government in meeting its duty of care in public health protection. If successful, such an approach would provide long-lasting oversight and protection for this South China community. Its motto could be Tuk Yam Heng Gong. Thank you very much.